Mark's asking for the link. Got it. He's going to be coming in a second. Let's go ahead and play this. I'm going to mute us up, guys. This is the CBS report that was on the other day. Quite scary. Troops right there on the border. Hold on.
Has added an additional 20,000 since the start of the war in Ukraine back in February. The U.S. military has added an additional 20,000 troops to the European theater, taking the total there to around 100,000. And many of those troops are in Eastern Europe. Only on CBS Mornings, we're getting a look at the U.S. forces closest to the fighting in Ukraine, supporting NATO allies and sending a very clear message to Russia. Charlie D'Agata is in Romania for us this morning. Charlie, good morning.
Good morning, Tony. Romania is now home to the 101st Airborne Division. It's the first time it's been headquartered here in Europe in nearly 80 years. This is some of the equipment they brought from home, a 777 howitzer, ready to roll at any minute. They're specifically trained to deploy on any battlefield in the world within hours.
Go, 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 go.
Ready to fight. The reason one of America's most elite air assault divisions has been sent right here, right now. We joined Deputy Commander Brigadier General John Lubis and Colonel Edwin Mathaidis, commander of the 2nd Brigade Combat Team, on board a Black Hawk helicopter for an hour's chopper ride to the very edge of NATO territory, around 3 miles from the border with Ukraine. From the start of the war, Russia advanced from Crimea along the Black Sea to Kherson, aiming to capture port cities like Mykolaiv and Odessa to landlock Ukraine. We're right about here.
We're ready to defend every inch of NATO soil. Why is it necessary to have the 101st here? We bring a unique capability. We're a light infantry force, but again, we bring that mobility through our aircraft and our air assaults.
We skirt along the Black Sea coast as we head further north.
We're roughly 20 miles away from Snake Island, this contentious island that's been fought over between the Ukrainians and the Russians, currently under Ukrainian control.
At a forward operating site, we watched as U.S. soldiers and Romanian troops pounded targets in a joint ground and air assault. The tank rounds and artillery fire are real. So is the enemy, meant to recreate the fight against Russian forces in Ukraine. A message to Russia and NATO allies alike: we're here.
The real meaning for me to have the American troops here is like if you were to have allies in Normandy before any enemy was there.
In all, roughly 4,700 soldiers of the 101st Screaming Eagles from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, have been deployed to reinforce NATO's eastern flank.
You've had an opportunity to watch, observe, and possibly study the Russians. What do you think of them so far?
So we're closely watching them. So we're building objectives to practice against that, replicate exactly what's going on in Ukraine. We're the closest American unit to the fighting in Ukraine.
And what does that feel like? What does that mean?
It keeps us on our toes, right? So it makes
Ready to fight tonight is a message that we've heard repeatedly. It's not just about defending NATO territory, but if the fight escalates and NATO partners are under threat, they're fully prepared to cross over into Ukrainian territory if ordered to do so. Back to you in the studio.
Oh, boy. Charlie D'Agata for us in Romania. 101st Airborne, they've deployed to every major conflict since D-Day, and you sure hope they don't have to add another one to the list.
Yes.
Oof, scary stuff. You're glad we have them, though.
Yeah, you're right about that.
I like.
Oh, my God.
Before we can give a Steve Sisolak commercial, I didn't want Mark to get too nauseous after he's seen that last little clip over there. The 101st Infantry Screaming Eagles, Mark, they're at the border, but there's a lot of other things. I mean, since this operation had started, I made a little bit of a list. This is in early February. We had immediate sanctions on Russia, but then followed by good-hearted stories like the ghost of Kiev. And then eventually, you know, we had sirens in Kiev, but we had YouTube playing at a Subway concert, followed by the Bucha false flag, the standoff in Azovstal steel plant. More sanctions on Russia. NATO troops we found out that were operating within the bounds of Ukraine. The ruble hit a record high. Russia mobilized. We had Nord Stream 2. Of course, the Donbass regions, they also joined and voted to remove themselves away from Ukraine and join the Russian Federation. And now we have all this craziness right now with I think the last stand in Kherson. We saw the troops very, very close. There's talk of a dirty bomb that's been floating around. But these nuclear exercises, where we are at today, Mark, we have Mark Sleboda here, ladies and gentlemen, in case you haven't noticed, our resident inside guy when it comes to this region over there. Mark, is there something different with these nuclear exercises that are going on? This time, it seems like the Russians alerted the Pentagon, and they might have done this all the time, but was there something a little bit extra special with this particular message, being the fact that they're letting them know that they're going to show what's going to happen in case of a nuclear strike?
Hi, Pasta. Hi, Fiorella. Thanks for having me.
Hi.
It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the conversation couch.
Love you. Welcome back. We love you, brother.
Yeah. So these Russian strategic exercises, nicknamed Grom or Thunder, come directly on the heels of NATO's strategic exercises over the last 2 weeks, Steadfast Noon, which was conducted in Europe. They were both strategic exercises, both utilized all three vectors of the trifecta of nuclear operations, of testing missiles, testing bombers, testing submarines. And these exercises were both annual exercises. They were both planned in advance. And it is absolutely normal to alert, the other side, the other strategic power, that you are about to conduct these exercises, usually well in advance. That was all followed, but it's just the context that it happens in that we're all now acutely aware that NATO and Russia are at war.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
that's it. We're
NATO. Yeah. Yeah, they're at war. But obviously it hasn't been like an outright declaration. But Mark, right before you came in, I don't know if you saw the 101st Battalion, right?
101st Airborne Division. Yes.
Yeah, Airborne Division. Yeah, I mean, Mark, you said they're at war. I agree with you, but they haven't admitted it. But with that, how do you deny that? How can at this point they deny that they're at war with Russia? I mean, this at least a proxy war. I mean, because they won't admit it. I mean, the media won't admit it. Nobody will admit it. But everybody here knows that this is what's happening, and everybody is afraid of what comes next.
Yeah, I mean, it goes far beyond just a proxy conflict where the U.S. and the other Western powers are openly shoving tens of billions of taxpayer dollars worth of arms and money into a regime that literally has state-armed and funded neo-Nazi battalions by the score, right? The Russian troops are, of course, and Ukrainians, or former Ukrainians now, former East Ukrainians, are dying at the hands of these weapons. They're dying at the hands of the intelligence, the planning. I mean, there's very little that the Ukrainians that serve the Kiev regime are doing at this point other than the actual dying, right? Everything is being run out of the Pentagon and the CIA. And we've heard from the Washington Post, we've heard from the New York Times that there are CIA and U.S. Special Forces and European commandos on the ground in Ukraine directing these forces, right? Now, of course, they pinky swear, oh, well, they're not actually directly involved in the combat. Yeah, okay, all right. We've heard that before, right? Most of your guests are old enough to remember, or at least to have heard of Vietnam, right? So I don't believe that anyone is actively buying this. But with the 101st Airborne, this is a new level. All right. The 101st Airborne has actually been there for several months now. They've increased the numbers that are there up to about 5,000 troops, but it's actually the focus on them and this quite orchestrated message that is being delivered through CBS, through the Western media, drawing attention. And they were saying very specific things. One, they were saying this is not a peacetime deployment. They said outright, this is a combat deployment. We are prepared to go to war with Russia in Ukraine tonight. Yeah, they said that outright. I mean, and they said the conditions that they would do so. If Russia attacks NATO, okay, in this case, it's specifically Romania because that's where they are. Yeah, I don't think that Russia's about to attack Romania or Peoria or Oakland, right, anytime soon, right? The other condition they gave is if Russia escalates in Ukraine. What the hell does that mean? Wait, there's a war, and the U.S. keeps saying we're not involved, we're not involved, but we have to win, and Russia has to lose, right? Now we have these ambiguous terms where the Biden administration is already U-turning, shifting from there won't be any U.S. boots on the ground. Well, there's already U.S. boots on the ground, but now they're about to put the 101st Airborne Division there as well. And other than this vague threat that an escalation would be enough for them to get involved, we also heard a very specific comments coming from CBS in this point. Comments that aren't a normal part of Western mainstream messaging on this. They specifically mentioned Odessa and that Russia is going to try to take Odessa and deny the Kiev regime the last major port city. And that was specifically in the context of that the 101st Airborne Division is there and that they are ready to deploy on a moment's notice. Because they're light infantry, right? They don't have any heavy weapons with them, which I hate to tell you, if you toss that into the battlefield in Ukraine right now, I don't care how mythologized these American superheroes are, they'd be ripped up in a heartbeat if they were actually dropped into the trenches in combat as a light infantry unit. But they specifically mentioned Odessa and that Russia would try to take Odessa. And I think that Russia will try to take Odessa somewhere down the line, 6 months to a year, right? There's definitely going to be a move there because Odessa is Russian speaking and Russian leaning, and they have been politically repressed and had the neo-Nazi jackboot shoved down on their neck there since 2014 to keep them in line and to keep them from joining the Donbass. And the fact that it was all being brought up in this context, and we've heard repeated narrative framework building statements coming out of the U.S., coming out of U.S. officials, coming out of Polish officials, the Polish foreign minister, coming out of, the former CIA director in general, Petraeus, that if Russia uses nuclear weapons, and they specifically mention a low-yield nuclear weapon like a TAC nuke or a dirty bomb in Ukraine, then that is the red line. And NATO force, well, not NATO forces, they don't say NATO because it wouldn't be NATO, but U.S. forces and a coalition of the willing, meaning the Poles and maybe the Baltics, right, will directly involved in Ukraine. They say that quite outright. And we even heard from the EU foreign policy chief, the EU high foreign policy, high muckety muck, Joseph Borrell, that if that was the case, then Russian forces would be annihilated. Well, that's some pretty big smack talking from a guy who leads an EU who doesn't even have a military, right? I mean, yeah. I'm just saying. But this is signaling. This is the same type of thing that we saw in Syria when the U.S. says, if Assad does this one thing, uses chemical weapons when he's winning, when Russia has intervened on his side, if he does this one thing, then we'll have to conduct airstrikes. Wink, wink, nod, nod. Even if it's such a slight thing as a, say, chlorine attack that anyone on the street could arrange with a few canisters ripped from a local factory, right? And sure enough, we saw ridiculous, well-debunked chemical weapons attacks and U.S. airstrikes on Damascus. This is exactly what is happening now, where we hear this repeated messaging, very specific. If Russia uses nuclear weapons, which have no utility for Russia in Ukraine, right? What are they going to do? Nuke Kiev? Are you serious? They want to free Kiev from this regime. They don't want to nuke Kiev. And certainly a dirty bomb being used by a country with the largest nuclear arsenal and the second largest military in the world, of which up till now it has only used 10% of its active duty capability. There's zero battlefield utility. A dirty bomb is not a battlefield weapon. It doesn't kill large numbers of people. It is an act of political terrorism. It is meant to instoke fear and reaction. And we have seen this regime in Kiev for the last nearly 3 months now themselves fire on their own nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, right? With our long-range artillery, some of it provided by the United States, and kamikaze drones, specifically targeting often the spent fuel containers there, and exactly to create such a dirty bomb incident on their own soil that would, they believe, draw the West into the conflict, lead to a direct military intervention. And they just, it's the same story that we've heard again and again from the beginning, that the Russians are doing this to themselves, right? The pro-Russian separatists in Donbass, they're shelling themselves. It's just something they do. I don't know why they do it. They just kill themselves, right? Yeah. We heard it with the Crimean Bridge. After an initial gloating and celebration and stamps and everything, when it turns out that it didn't actually destroy the bridge, a few hours later, as it was back to, oh, no, we didn't do it. The Russians did it to themselves. The Russians blew up their own 30 billion pipeline.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. They're blowing themselves up in the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, right, in order to blame Ukraine. That's the same ridiculous stories repeated absolutely uncritically by the Western media, doing as the stenographers they are. And while I am sure that most of your listeners out there for the Conversation Couch audience don't believe this sheeple pablum, unfortunately, most Americans will just accept it without any thought because Russia, right? I mean, that's what Russians do, evidently. They just kill themselves, when it's least convenient for them and most convenient for the West to do so. And this signaling is to create such an incident where the U.S. and Poland will say, oh, nukes have been used. We're going to have to go into Ukraine and create a safe zone, right? Not to directly engage with the Russian troops. That's not what it's going to be. It's going to be U.S. and Polish troops in uniform, because there's already thousands of them there as quote unquote mercenaries at this point, particularly the Poles. But it will be them going in to create a safe zone. And let's be frank, if they go into Western Ukraine, Russia will make a lot of noise and they'll scream and they'll yell and they won't do anything, because West Ukraine is not East Ukraine. Russia doesn't really want to go into West Ukraine to begin with. And because the population there, unlike East Ukraine, they hate Russians, right? They hate Russians and they hate Russia. It's part of their history. their cultural, their national identity conception, it's completely the opposite of the people of East Ukraine. But if the U.S. goes into Odessa, if they send the 104th Airborne just across the border there in Romania into southern Ukraine and put boots on the ground in Odessa to create a human tripwire and say to Russia, what are you going to do now? Are you going to come and try and take Odessa while there's U.S. light infantry on the ground there in Odessa? It's actually very similar to what Russia did in Syria, when Russia put troops on the ground to create facts on the ground and said, you're not going to overthrow the government in Damascus now. And then the U.S. said, oh, yeah, well, we're going to camp out in East Syria. What are you going to do about it? And we're still staring across the line, across the Tigris in Syria right now with the U.S., occupation forces on one side of the river and Russian and the Syrian government on the other. Well, we could very soon be facing exactly that situation in Ukraine. And I believe that is what all this pablum nonsense talk about nuclear weapons, Russia's warning that Russia is taking this very seriously. After months of no contact at all, the Russian defense minister contacted the British foreign minister, the French foreign minister, the U.S. foreign minister, the Turkish foreign minister, all within 12 hours, and say, your client regime is about to let off a dirty bomb there, and we're not going to sit and take it, and we know you're involved. And then they went around and told China and India, this is what they're doing, right? So Russians taking this very seriously. Hopefully, the attention they are putting on this will avert Kiev's plans, but there's no guarantee of that at this moment. And if this is, passed over as this incident extremis, right, that will allow, Biden to do his U-turn on policy and put U.S. uniformed troops on the ground in Ukraine, then it will be something else, because this is what they're seeing, that with the Russia calling up its reserves and taking off the kid gloves with this, the new strategy of crippling the Kiev regime's electricity infrastructure to inhibit their military logistics, because everything in Ukraine is moved around by trains, and the trains run on electricity. So you take out the electricity network, they can't move around troops, they can't move around tanks, they can't move around fuel, ammunition, artillery shells, anything.
Yeah.
With that type of strategy, and it has to be said that that's what the U.S. does on day one, right? That's what when they went into Iraq, they took out the electrical infrastructure on day one.
Yeah.
Russia is doing this 9 months into the conflict. They really should have done it a lot earlier. They should have called up the reserves a lot earlier. But I believe they were signaling to NATO that our intentions are limited, and let's sit down at the negotiation table with the terms that we talked about at the beginning of this. And that was just ignored. And now Russia is forced to escalate to this step after the flood of Western weapons into the country. They beat the first Ukrainian army. I mean, they completely demilitarized the existing Ukrainian military, which was quite significant. And now they're on finishing off the second one. The West is running out of military supplies to send Ukraine. You see that in the Western mainstream media headlines, right? We don't have any more artillery shells. We don't have any more artillery pieces. There's not air defense that we can easily give them. We can't give them main battle tanks or fighter jets because the training time would be years. So they've run out of things that they can give them. And they see the only thing they have left is direct military intervention.
Yep. There's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot of questions I want to ask. There's Odessa, that's on the table right now. I mentioned all these things. I forgot to mention the Crimean Bridge. I'm surprised you guys didn't catch me. But there's so much going on right now. A lot of people are saying, well, what's going to happen? Is this dirty bomb for real? Is this just nonsense? How do they have this information ahead of time? Is this going to draw the troops in from the United States and out of the Crimean border? Even one of our followers over here on the Convo Couch on the Rokfin, guys, if you haven't gone over to Rokfin, please do. I suspect the 101st Infantry or Division aren't there to fight. I think they will be the next Pearl Harbor. I expect a dirty bomb may turn up on just on the Romanian side. I hope I'm wrong. But I mean, everything's on the table right now. United States does not care about human life. It seems like they'll do anything to maybe draw themselves into this war. But I want to talk a little bit more about the dirty bomb before we get to Odessa, because Odessa is an interesting situation. I was listening to Scott Ritter on Garland Nixon show this morning talking about some of the tactics that the Russians would use, especially at the end of World War II, where on the retreat, Germany would set up a lot of fortress towns, hoping that they would, fortify these fortresses towns, that the Russians would come in, spend a lot of energy, waste a lot of lives trying to take back these towns. But instead, they just surrounded a lot of these towns, formed blockades until their enemy suffered enough and then gave up. A lot of people think that that might happen in Odessa. I want your opinions about what they might do with Odessa, and talk about the dirty bomb. How did they get this information that they can accurately put out there and say, hey, listen, they're going to use this dirty bomb, just like we call Bucha, we'll call in dirty bomb right now.
Okay, so how do they know about this? Because Russia has so many moles in Ukraine that it's like Swiss cheese, right?
Gotcha.
And that's been obvious. If you read the headlines, you will constantly see articles about hundreds of collaborators, thousands of collaborators have been arrested in Ukraine. Why? Why would they collaborate with Russia? Because they don't regard this regime that seized power in there in 2014 as their own, right? They don't want to be part of a Banderistan that is against, turning Ukraine into a Western battle platform against Russia. There's lots of Ukrainians that feel that way. Now, there's lots of Ukrainians that don't feel that way, particularly from the west of the country. But the whole point of this and why there's been a civil conflict in the country is that it is a national identity divided country, right? That's why there's been a civil conflict there. Ukrainians don't all agree on this, on the course of the government since 2014, since the war. It was just a couple of months ago that the Kiev regime announced that the head of their intelligence service and their prosecutor general were fired and were being charged with treason. Why? Because they had found some 600 collaborators in the intelligence services and in the prosecutor, general's office, just 600 in the ranks of two government institutions that were working with Russia, right? Or they believe they were working with Russia. Regardless, it's almost certain they didn't get all of them, and that there are still plenty of moles out there. And this has been echoed in the Western press. It has been talked about in the pages of Washington Post and the New York Times that, these anonymous CIA and MI6 officials admit that, that the Kiev regime is riddled with moles. That's how.
Wow. And the Odessa question, as far as about, like you said, 6 months, is that just strategically they're going to wait things out for maybe everything to change? And also, too, your good friend Gonzalo Lira said eventually that they're going to take Kiev. I know, I'm just joking. I
go on his show, man. I go on his show.
But listen, and when somebody told me that, like, dude, I just heard this great discussion between Gonzalo Lira and Mark Sleboda. I was like, oh, shit, I got to see that. That's got to be interesting. But he did say eventually Russia will eventually take Kiev. And I'm wondering right now, after hearing, Putin's speech, not the recent one, but the one a week ago when he took questions from the press, and he kind of alluded to the fact, like, listen, when this started, we didn't want to go in there and take these things, but it seems like they've left them no choice. That how could they allow this government to still stay in place? That eventually they're going to have to march all the way east, the way Mr. Lira said, and take Odessa, take Kiev. Yep. I know I've got multiple questions here, but please go right ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, and if you'll remember, I said this at the beginning of the conflict. The Kremlin was naive. They
did say that.
They thought that this would be something that they could intimidate, make a show of force, make some ground, and then everything would be to the negotiation table. And no, right? And we heard from Mark Milley, the U.S., the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in the last week, that the U.S. feels that if Russia wins in Ukraine, if they lose, then that will be the end of the collapse of the rules-based order. What is this rules-based order? Oh, that's the rules that the U.S. sets, not international law, not the UN Charter. That's their rules-based order, i.e., that is code for U.S. hegemony, U.S.-led Western global hegemony and primacy. They feel that that is on the line here. And if they feel that is on the line, and Russia feels that what is happening in Ukraine is an existential national security threat to them, that means that neither side is willing to back down, which means that Russia has no option at this point but regime change in Kiev. That's the only thing that it won't end it, but it will provide an end, right? Like I said back in February, this is a forever war. This is an area of permanent destabilization of Europe right now, of a new bloody Berlin Wall, which will be the Dnieper River between the East and the West, between Russia and NATO. And there will always be insurgency on one side or the other. There will always be conflict there. Even if you kick this regime out of Kiev, even if Zelensky is forced to take an apartment up with Juan Guaido and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and they all can pretend that they rule countries together, right? Even if that's the situation, it won't end, because the people of West Ukraine, of Banderistan, as I like to call it, Galicia in historical terms, will never accept this. So it's not going to end there. And why 6 months, right? Well, first of all, Russia's still on the defensive, right? The Kiev regime's counteroffensives are still continuing.
You're talking about
right?
Odessa now, right?
Yes, Odessa, right? That's why that it will be at least 6 months, probably a year before there's a serious move on Odessa, somewhere between there. Because right now, Russian forces are still on the defensive because they're still suffering from the result of not having enough manpower, right? While the Kiev regime forcibly conscripted the entire country. That, has been playing out for months now. And that the result is, the counteroffensives that we have seen going on, Russia's, withdrawals in several places. The new defensive lines they set have actually held now for over 3 weeks. There's been no significant movement, and really brutal casualties, particularly in the Kherson steppes on the Ukrainian side. But Russia's still in the defensive mode, and it will be another 4 to 6 weeks of Kiev regime counteroffensive finally grinding to a halt and running out of steam. And it's about that time that the Russian reservists, the 300,000 plus reservists that have been called up, will be brought in. And that will more than double the amount of forces that Russia has had in the, quote, special military operation, the intervention, since February. That will more than double it, right? So that's really significant. That is definitely going to change things. But there will still be 6 weeks of Kiev regime counteroffensives or offensive, however you want to call it, before that. And Russia may have to withdraw from a few other places yet until that tide is turned. But once that tide is turned, this has been like an Ardennes forest offensive in World War II for Kiev. They threw everything they have left into this. And once it peters out, that's it. They won't be capable of another counteroffensive like that again, because they will have wasted so much Western hardware that cannot be replaced at this point, and they're completely dependent on it. So this is their last-ditch effort. And when it turns, it's going to turn hard, because that will be when the Russian reservists are entering the theater. And there will almost certainly be a Russian winter offensive, right? But Odessa first, they have to be thrown back from the area in Kherson that they're in. Then Nikolaev has to be taken because Nikolaev is a major city on the way in southern Ukraine on the way to Odessa. And then there's Odessa. And they're not going to just give up Odessa, which means Odessa will have to be surrounded. And that will be a major exercise requiring upwards of 100,000 Russian troops, probably around 150,000 to 200,000, to effectively surround Odessa and cut off the supply lines to it and deal with it. And we saw how long the Azov held out in Mariupol, right, for 2 months. That's why I say this is going to be a very long conflict.
Yeah, and so today Putin actually said that Ukraine has effectively lost its sovereignty. We can argue, that Ukraine did this, lost its sovereignty in 2014 with U.S. intervention, but he actually called Ukraine a battering ram for the West. In terms of what you just said, also Ukraine has said that they want to join NATO in 2 years. But because of what you're saying this is going to be a long conflict, because of some of the analysis of perhaps Russia feeling like they have to expand not just to East Ukraine, but beyond Odessa even. Do you think that Ukraine will actually join NATO? Because I keep thinking like, what part of Ukraine will be left at that point?
What rump piece of Ukraine are you talking about in 2 years' time? Because
yeah,
all right. They've already lost the Donbass. Russia has already laid claim through the results of referendums, however much you may choose to believe them or not. I have family there, in East Ukraine, so I know what the actual score is in that part of the country, say as compared to the west of the country. So I'm fully on board with that. But that's Kherson and Zaporozhye, and the way this conflict is going, they will have no choice but to do the same in Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkov and Sumy and Chernigov until all of Ukraine east and south of the Dnieper have been brought into the fold, because they see that the West has been operating, the U.S. primarily, under this, very simplistic geopolitical mindset of a risk board, right? You remember risk, right? Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. If you see an area on the board that is not occupied, if it is, say, a gray area, you've got two choices. You either take that area and you make it part of your side, or the other side will take it and use it against you, right? And the U.S. was Ukrainian neutrality, right, was no longer acceptable to the U.S. Neutrality was in the Ukrainian constitution until 2014, until the government was overthrown and the openly U.S.-backed Bush there. They could not join NATO. They could not join the CSTO. Neutrality was enshrined in their constitution. After 2014, the U.S. considered that they had geopolitically flipped it, and neutrality was no longer an option. Ukraine was to be used as a battering ram, right, against Russia, in the same way that the U.S. intends to use Taiwan against China. And it's an old Rand Corporation strategy. It's called the pressure cooker. You surround your adversaries with hostile states by hook or crook, right? You bring into power political forces in those countries that will serve as willing proxies for use against your adversary. You surround them with them. That is exactly the intention. It was the intention with Georgia, with the Saakashvili strongman regime down there. It's the intention with Ukraine. And that is exactly what the West has been working off of. They will not back off of it at this point, because they see the Russian and Chinese and even Iranian strategic partnership has grown so strong at this point that they have a very limited window timetable left in which to operate before Russia has regained enough military capacity, and China has built up military capacity such that they can no longer dictate to those countries in their own backyards.
Yeah, it's also the plan to do that. What do you say? Hook or crook? Kosovo, Guatemala, Syria, Honduras, Nicaragua, Chile, Brazil. The list
Libya.
goes on and on. Libya. It doesn't stop. Fam, you got anything else for our longtime returning champion, most episodes as a guest on the Convo Couch, insider Mark Sleboda?
I just crash on your couch, Pasta.
You can. Yeah,
it should be my couch to crash on when you're not.
Crashed on the crash couch with Mark Sleboda. He's crashing on. He's like the guy on the couch from Half Baked. Anything else, fam?
Yeah, I just have one last question, Mark. Everybody's freaking out right now, rightfully so.
Good.
With the escalations of from the everybody except U.S. Americans, only a segment of them, right? We've seen the squad retract this letter of diplomacy that they had for Biden quickly when they were told no. They reiterated their support for the for Ukraine and for Zelensky, saying that they didn't want to sound like Republicans. So now, the anti-war left is no more in the United States. It hasn't been for a long time. But more importantly, the everybody is freaking out everywhere else because they're seeing this escalation pushed by NATO, by these troops, by everything that is the attacks against Russia, the just pushing the buttons of Russia, while Russia has been very much restrictive. Is nuclear war inevitable? I mean, at this point, like, do we still have any sort of, like, as if you were, a fortune teller, if you were like the guy from the future, do we still have time to save us from going into maybe not necessarily nuclear war, but even like a world war, which I think eventually would end with nukes? Like, is there a possibility right now to save us from doing that? Do you think we're going to get there, or do you see us going a different route?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, with regards to the progressive congressional caucus, and they're tucking their tails between their heads, I just had this mental image stuck in my head, and I want to stick it in your head, of Nancy Pelosi in dominatrix gear, right? Leather PVC from head to foot, cracking the whip on the progressives and saying, "Get back in line! Get back in line! Kiss my boots!" And they did.
Thank you for sticking that in my head, Mark. I really appreciate it. Nancy Pelosi in spandex is the last thing I need right now.
We had to make things worse. Progressives, get back in line. I put it up there for you. They couldn't even be anti-war for 24 hours. They couldn't last 24 friggin' hours. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I have been very I have not believed that nuclear war was on the table with the U.S. and Russia for years now. I have always been the one to talk that down, despite what was happening in Syria and whatever, from a realist standpoint and watching the deconfliction that was going on, I was saying, don't worry about it. Don't worry about that. Now, I do not believe that nuclear war is inevitable, but I actually believe it is a serious possibility. And that should frighten you, right? Yeah. That alone, right? I mean, you can pay attention to this nuclear clock, the scientists have it however many seconds per midnight. Yeah. But they've had those hands positioned kind of funnily for years now. But there is a serious possibility now. Right. Russia, the Russian president was very clear on that. He gave a speech back in September that has been terribly distorted and just disinfo misrepresented out of, just complete absurdity, where he said that in a very almost boilerplate, U.S. type statement, where that he will use all means at his disposal, all systems to defend Russia and the Russian people, right? That's what he said. That became in the Western mainstream media headlines, Putin threatens to use TAC nukes in Ukraine. Right? I mean, how that happened? Go back and read the statements and see how they have been distorted. And he said that. What's more, the sentence before, the paragraph before, and the paragraph after made clear that he was saying that, particularly in the context that he had received threats from high-ranking Western officials threatening to use nuclear weapons on Russian forces in Ukraine. Right? He said that before, and he said that after his statement that Russia will use all means at their disposal to defend Russia and the Russian people, that he had received nuclear threats. That was completely left out of Western mainstream media, or just dismissed out of hand. The one time I did see it mentioned in paragraph 17 of a New York Times story, right? It was dismissed out of hand. But I mean, we have heard so much in recent years. The Pentagon has been so hot to develop and deploy what they call more usable battlefield nuclear weapons. They've got them, they developed them, they deployed them, and they are specifically for use against Russia and China. They wanted weapons that weren't just a strategic weapon. They wanted nuclear weapons that they can use on the battlefield.
That's where we're at. And Joe Biden is taking us into World War III, nuclear war. I don't think he's calling the shots, Mark. I think there's somebody behind the scenes. Listen, I do have this.
Didn't he just say something about President Kamala Harris? I mean,
well, forget about. I mean, the other day, just 2 days ago, he saluted a tractor when he heard the music and he didn't know which way to get off the stage. Listen, I think it's great that a lot of people are applying a lot of pressure to people like the squad and to members like Bernie Sanders, or Bernie Sanders hasn't got it yet. Somebody's going to catch him sooner or later. Ayanna Pressley got it. AOC, they won't leave her alone. Well, this is what happened the other day with Elizabeth Warren. I want your thoughts on this one.
Senator, you have got to stop funding Nazi-infested Ukrainian regimes. You are bringing us to the brink of nuclear war. You have got those billions could be used for a lot of good things here in the U.S. Instead of funding Nazis in Ukraine, they're preparing a dirty bomb to detonate and blame on Russia. This is not why we're here. I am here to make sure that billions of lives are saved instead of getting into a nuclear war. You've asked me, I heard you. Yes. I will move toward the exit.
Yes.
That's right. No. Nuclear war. Yes, I'm black and brown too. And I don't want them to die in a nuclear war that my tax money is funding, because the Congress and the Senate are funding Nazis in Ukraine. Do you want a nuclear war? A nuclear war will cancel your debt and your life. I have sent letters, I have sent emails, I have made calls to these senators and congressmen. They refuse to respond. We are marching to nuclear war behind fools in political office. They have got to stop it. Nuclear war is the issue. Nuclear war. Consideration.
None of this matters. None of this matters if there's a nuclear war and we all die. In 2018, there was
And my thoughts on this? This has all happened before. Check your history. In the 1950s, the U.S. funded an insurgency of SS veterans in West Ukraine, the people who were the grandparents of the Banderites who infest the Kiev regime right now. And the CIA actually led this insurgency against the Soviet Union on the ground. Even the LA Times did a piece on this, I believe, a couple of years ago. The U.S. did the same thing with the very same Banderite fascists in Ukraine back in the 1950s. They didn't learn their lesson. They're doing the same thing again. And it's really great that a few U.S. politicians are being confronted on this, but there's broad bipartisan consensus. The U.S. foreign policy does not change until there is some systemic regime change in that country. And if it doesn't work this time for some reason, they'll do it again.
It's kind of crazy because we understand what's going on as far as, you know, the regime change playbook, Brzezinski's chessboard. Let's create another Afghan situation for the Russians on their border. Do you think that what the Russians are doing in Latin America, mainly like with countries like Nicaragua, where they're pretty much getting entrenched in there and helping them out with their forces, their military, is a way of poking back the bear on their hemisphere? Or do you think there's a little bit more to it, just trying to establish countries that have similar governments and similar needs, maybe trading routes? What are your thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, let's be clear. The amount of Russian military engagement with countries like Nicaragua or Ecuador is next to nothing, right? It's mostly rhetorical. There's not anything really significant going on there. The U.S. just reacts if Russia even looks at the Western Hemisphere. That's our hemisphere, right? You know, how dare you look? If they even have diplomatic relations, it's seen as a threat. Russia has next to no military relations with Nicaragua or with Ecuador or with Venezuela. And they have next to nothing economic relations either, because they, you know, it's the other side of the world, and Russia's geoeconomic horizons just aren't that big, and neither are their geopolitical horizons. That's just, you know, sure, Russia would, you know, make some statements that if you keep poking us in our backyard, we could poke you there, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, if you'll remember, there was a big show that Russia flew a couple of bombers to Venezuela a couple of years ago, and so on. But that was just for show, right? That didn't really do anything. There wasn't really any change there. It was making a statement. And I'm going to be frank. Russia doesn't have the military capability to set up. It just does not have the geopolitical horizons that the Soviet Union did. They don't have the capability to do it.
Fam.
That's
it for Mr. Sleboda today. Mark Sleboda, ladies and gentlemen, our returning champion. A guy who always comes on for quite some time. Mark, we've been doing this for 5 years now. That it's the end of October. You know, we started it 5 years ago. You were one of our first guests back in the days to educate us on so many things and to keep us abroad of what's going on. Did you have a trip recently to Crimea or to the Donbass recently? Have you any plans on going?
Yeah.
How was it?
I don't like the Crimea personally. It's a little too arid for me, but I mean,
a little too what?
Arid. It's a little too dry. Remember, the water was cut off to the Crimea for 8 years. You know, by the Kiev regime that built a dam to stop the flow of water, a whole crime against humanity thing that the West ignored, right? To collectively punish the Crimean people. But even before that, Crimea is a pretty dry place. Yes, it's warmer, but I like the Arctic anyway. I take all my vacations in the Arctic, so we have family there, so we go there. But I can't say that it's really my cup of tea. And the Donbass, Donetsk is still being shelled nearly every day. Yeah. So that is not a pleasant place, and it won't be a pleasant place until all of the regime's fortress areas, you know, outside of Donetsk, Adveyevka, Pesky, and so on are taken. And they'll have to be taken building by building, because every building has been turned into a firing point and a fortress. And the old Soviet factories with their bomb shelters, it's the same Azovstal, you know, story all over again. They'll have to be completely surrounded and choked off, and building to building, basement to basement, room to room search and clearing, you know, which is a type of combat that heavily favors the defenders. It's tough. It will be done, but it will take time. And until that, civilians will keep dying in Donetsk as they have been dying for the last 8 years. Poroshenko, the previous president of the Kiev regime, you know, he said it quite openly. We will win this conflict because our children will go to schools and their children will cower huddled in basements.
Yeah.
He said that openly. It's on YouTube. Anyone can check it. Well, the reality is now is, well, the shoe is on the other foot. And the people who've backed this regime, often they now have to hide in basements or metros with their children because their cities are being bombed in return.
Porchop Poroshenko also said that he built a facility, a NATO facility inside the borders of Ukraine. And you know who was at Porchop Poroshenko's inauguration? One Joe Biden. Mark Sleboda, ladies and gentlemen, our insider, our returning champion, our man of mans. He likes the
vampire.
Vampire. He likes the snow better than the sun, and he's got a crow back there hanging on out. We love you, Mark Sleboda.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate you. And happy Halloween, by the way. It's my favorite time of the year.
You guys should hook on up, and I'll virtually cook your meal. We love you, Mark.
Happy stuff, man.
We love you, brother. He's the best.
Bye.
Mark Sleboda, ladies and gentlemen. Fam, he's fire when he comes to the show, man. That was a great show. So many things to talk about. Wow.